What would you do if you knew you had only today? If this was your last day and you knew it? I think we catch a glimpse of Jesus' answer to that question in the text we're going to be hearing in just a few minutes. The portion of the text I'm reading comes from what is known as Jesus' high priestly prayer. It's the longest recorded prayer by Jesus in the Gospels, and it's a prayer that encompasses all of chapter 17. It is 26 verses long. Somehow I'm thinking that probably wasn't the only long prayer that Jesus ever prayed, but it's the one that has been given to us. So listen now to these few words of Jesus's, starting in verse 20. I ask not only on behalf of these, the 12 disciples, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given them, so that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become completely one, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I love these few lines. They don't seem very consequential in the big scheme of things, but they are. Because in these few lines, we hear Jesus praying for us, for all of us. Perhaps not by name, but he's praying for the future church, which happens to be us for Jesus today. It's beautiful that somehow, right before he died, we, as the cliche goes, we were on Jesus' mind. But before we talk about us, let's talk about what's happening before Jesus even prays this prayer. In John's gospel, this is Thursday night. Jesus knows that in a very short time he will be betrayed. He will be handed over to his enemies. His best friends will all deny him and run from him. He will be tried, convicted, and ultimately crucified. And in response to what he knows is coming, Jesus gathers together those closest to him and offers them those final instructions, words of grace and hope and encouragement. He has a final meal with them, and then in one final act of love, he goes out into the garden and he prays for them. And he prays for us. He prays that those disciples that he will leave behind will be one as he is one with the Father. He prays that they might find strength and meaning in their unity as God's people. And he prays that those who come after will know that they are loved and cherished, that they will know the unifying love that God has placed in their midst, that we, the church, would be one even after Christ has been crucified, risen, and ascends to the Father. He thinks about the church in the future, and he asks that they might have the same gifts and graces as the church he is building and leaving behind. It's a beautiful word for us today. Now, I don't know if there was conflict or division in the early church that John, the gospel writer, is writing to the church, but we do know that unity was really important to Jesus, because he wouldn't be praying for that just before he's killed if it wasn't important. He wants the witness of the church to be unity. He wants the witness of the church to be love, and he puts those two things together. Where there is unity among the disciples of Christ, there is love, the love that God has for each of us. It's that self-sacrificing, reconciling love, the love that we now in the church call grace. And it's a love that is both a command, like when Jesus says, "This commandment I give you, to love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another, so that all might know that you are my disciples." And then it's also a choice. It's a choice that sometimes is difficult to make and sometimes is pretty easy to make. It's difficult for people like Peter when he has this vision that God says, everything that I've created is clean, so go ahead and sit with the Gentiles and eat with them. Peter had a choice to make, and he chose to go eat with the Gentiles. It was a hard choice for Peter, because if you go into Acts and you read the conversation, you see that Peter wasn't quite sure that that was really the right thing to do. So sometimes the love that we're called to is simply an act of obedience, and it might cause us discomfort, but it's still an act of unity in love with the other. Over the past 5 weeks, we've heard a lot about what that kind of unifying love looks like. We heard when Jesus brought a child into the midst of his followers, and he said, if you want to see what the kingdom of God looks like, if you want to see what unity and love look like, look at this child. And we heard about some of the characteristics of those children. But do you remember what drove the illustration with the child? It was a question that the disciples asked Jesus. And I think it's a question that people are still asking today. Here's how Matthew 18:1 reads. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" This question has driven humanity since the beginning of time. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? This was the question that drove the first murder in the Bible. In Genesis 4, when Cain and Abel have to bring their offering to God, Cain didn't kill his brother because Abel could grow nice vegetables in the vegetable garden. Abel died because his gifts were accepted by God, and all of a sudden, his brother believed that he was no longer the greatest. And so instead of finding a solution to that, instead of having a conversation with God about that, he took his brother's life. And then, well, he was the greatest. Our history is riddled with violence and power, the use of power one over another, so that we might know who is the greatest. The Romans were certainly not in Israel because they wanted to worship the God of the Jewish people. The Romans were there to make sure that everyone in the known world knew that they were the greatest. They killed, they stole, and they destroyed everything and everyone in their path so that they would be known as the greatest. Who is the greatest? Christian history is riddled with people who used violence and power over others. In the name of Christ, we killed and we stole and we destroyed entire civilizations because, well, they weren't worshiping just quite the right way. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Our own American history is riddled with violence and destruction of other cultures. We herd them up and we put them on reservations. We killed, we maimed, and we destroyed because they were less than human. They were savages. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? What we've learned about Jesus bringing a child into the midst of the people, the power structures of his own day, is that who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is the one who has passionate faith, who trusts in God, who is humble, and lowly, who has joy even in the midst of the suffering and conflicts in the world, who sees those everyday miracles. Who is the greatest is the one who opens their hearts and their arms to be inclusive, even when there are differences one to another. These are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Somehow we have forgotten that it is those characteristics that Jesus holds up and says, if you are one with me and the Father, then these are the things that unify us, that pull us together and do not tear us apart. These are the things in love that make us one with God and one with each other. These are the very things that bring life and dignity and fullness. These are the promises of grace that we all share together. No matter where we are, no matter where we come from, no matter what our zip code is or isn't. These are the things that Christ has brought to us. I had a professor in seminary, Billy Abraham, who said that while we hear these things and we know these things, each one of us shares what he calls spiritual amnesia. It's the thing that helps us to forget the gifts of God. In our own confession, we say every month, we have failed to be an obedient church. We have not done your will. We have broken your law. We have rebelled against your love. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. Spiritual amnesia. Week after week, we hear about the things of God, the way that God has asked all of us to live and move and have being in this world. We see the example of Christ living and moving among the least, the last, and the lost. And yet, we have spiritual amnesia. We go to Bible studies, we do our daily devotions. We have spiritual conversations with one another. There are things that we see that break our hearts, and yet we have spiritual amnesia. We so quickly forget the things that bring fullness of life. We so easily set aside and cast aside those people who we are called to love. We so easily forget that our own bodies are temples of God's Holy Spirit, to be nurtured, to take Sabbath, to be loved, to be used by God for God's good purposes. We trifle away our time, and then we wonder if God is even present to us. Spiritual amnesia. But Jesus comes along and he says, in the midst of your amnesia, I'm still going to show up. I am still going to take this child, and I am still going to put this child in the midst of your lives. And I am going to help you to remember the goodness and the grace that comes when you become one people. When you become the people transformed into the image and likeness that you were always meant to live into. This is the gift that keeps coming and reminding and coming and reminding over and over again. So what do we do with this gift? How do we begin to repair the divisions that are so evident in our lives, in the lives of our community, in our workplaces? I'm not even going to talk about what's happening in Washington. Thanks be to God. We have a choice every single day to do the things that God is asking us to do, to be one with God and one with each other. And I think the problem that we run into over and over again is this is really hard. And the longer we live in the divisiveness of our culture, the harder it becomes. It's hard because eventually we start to believe that it's those other people that have it wrong, that they must be thinking the wrong way and living the wrong way, and we have all the right answers. And so instead of entering into meaningful conversation, respectful conversation, we just don't listen and we don't talk to them. We unfriend them with the click of a button. And that's it. They're out of our lives and we don't have to worry about those people because they don't know the right way to live or think anyway. But what if in an act of self-giving, reconciling love, we actually listened? Without thinking about what we're going to respond next with, but we actually listened to the other, whose opinion we might not necessarily agree with, but who is also created in the image and likeness of God and deserves dignity and respect. It's not easy to admit that sometimes we might not have it right, that we might have to adjust our way of thinking and understanding situations that come our way. It's hard work. It is really hard work. But I think what's even harder and perhaps even more relevant is what if we consider just for a moment that our way of thinking and living is not really in line with what Jesus commands from us? That we really don't love God with all our heart and mind and soul and strength and our neighbor as ourselves. Because we've decided what that kind of love looks like in our own human capacity instead of looking at Jesus and the life he led and saying that's what it really looks like to love God and love our neighbor. That's probably harder than admitting we might not have it right. That not only do we not have right our social constructs, but we might not even have our spiritual constructs quite right either. If we were under Christ's microscope, would we measure up? I wouldn't. I wouldn't. The prayer is, make them one. Father, as I am one with you, and you are with me, so that their witness might be love. Recently, I was talking to a colleague, just last week, as a matter of fact, and we were talking about the people who mentored us in the faith. Those people who had impassioned faith, who trusted in God, who were humble, who had joy no matter what else was going on in their lives, and who were so inclusive, it was disturbing. And our lists were long. And he said to me, when he finished seminary and entered the process toward ordination, he realized that he wasn't called to ordination at all. But instead, he was called to serve the church and to serve people, no matter where they were. He didn't need to be in the pulpit to do that. And it was beautiful to see the excitement on his face and to hear about the ministry that he does outside of the local church. But the most important part of that conversation was the part of the conversation where he said he understood how God had worked to transform his life in love. He said that at the beginning of his journey, he understood that love meant that you simply didn't do anything to anyone that you didn't want them to do to you, right? You didn't do anything to anyone that you didn't want them to do to you, so do no harm, which means you avoid, in his mind, conflict at all costs. You never enter into important conversations. You never really hurt anybody's feelings by saying they might have it wrong. You never hurt your own feelings by saying, wow, I might have it wrong. You just go along to get along. Until one day, he said somebody asked him, well, what are you doing in your church? Do you teach a class? Do you work with children? Do you go on mission trips? Do you work at a food pantry? And his only answer was no. No, I don't do anything. And suddenly he realized that the self-sacrificing love of Jesus Christ meant that you didn't just not do harm, you actually did something with the gifts that God had given. And so he started to understand that to love his neighbor as himself was not just to not disturb the neighbor, but it was to actually meet the neighbor where the neighbor was and play on a level field, and to start to put somebody else's needs in front of his own, and to maybe begin to see others as just as valuable to God as he was to God. It transformed his life. It transformed the lives of those he works with and prays for and plays with now. That's the power of the self-sacrificing love that Jesus prays for all of us today. He decided that it was better to be known for what he believes in. It's better to be known for what he believes to be true and good and right than to be not known for anything substantial at all. Do no harm is certainly part of a Wesleyan understanding of the faith, but the other part of that faith is to do all the good that you possibly can. That's the beauty of the unifying love of Jesus Christ. In the book written by Dr. Henry Cloud, and I'm sorry, but the name has just escaped me, Necessary Endings, Dr. Cloud says this: later is one of the most abused drugs we have available to us. It kind of makes things go away. Why? Because when we say it, we think we are actually going to do it later. Later. I don't think that we can wait until later to do the things that God is asking us to do. We can no longer, as a church, as people of faith, wait until later to have a passionate faith that trusts God. We can no longer wait until later to find joy in the life circumstances that we have. We can no longer wait until later to serve people in humble lowliness and humility because we might not like them or agree with them or believe that they are worthy. We can no longer wait until later to humble ourselves. We can no longer wait until later to be an inclusive community of faith. We keep saying that later we will be the people God wants us to be. But for the sake of our children and our children's children, we have got to stop waiting for later. Jesus calls us now to be faithful disciples now, today. Jesus prayed for those who would come after him, that they would be one and that they would be witnesses to the love of God in Jesus Christ. We are here because someone heard that prayer and told the story. And told the story and told the story all the way back to those disciples who abandoned Jesus but yet had the courage to get out of that upper room and go tell the story. They left us a legacy. They didn't wait until later to leave the legacy. They got out, and at the risk of their lives, they told the story. It might be time for us to risk our lives. It might be time for us to take a risk in love and not wait until later and not wait for someone else to do it. But maybe it's time for us to actually embrace the identity that Jesus prayed for us, that we would actually be the church that loved fully and completely today, that had faith and trust and humility and joy and inclusiveness. For the sake of our children and our children's children, we have to stop waiting for later, and we have to grab that legacy today, right now. And we have to be the church that Jesus prayed for. And if we claim that identity, then we will definitely leave a legacy. And it won't be the legacy that others leave. It won't be a legacy of divisiveness. It won't be a legacy of cruelty. It won't be a legacy of power over others. But instead, it will be a legacy of unifying love that brings us together in spite of our differences, and says to our children and our children's children and all those who will come later, this is the gift that Christ has given to us. This is the gift that we give to you. I can't speak for any of you. I can only speak for myself. But that's the gift I want to give my grandchildren. What is the gift we will leave the children?